Hi, this is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. On this episode, we're looking at Dick Tracy for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I'm going to start off with a personal anecdote. Not to just talk about myself, but to illustrate my lack of nostalgic bias for this game. Let's set the stage. It was the summer of 1990, and Dick Tracy was everywhere. Disney's marketing department was working overtime to promote the movie, hoping it would see the overwhelming success Batman had the previous summer. I was a 7-year-old boy, the prime target demographic for this campaign, and thanks to my lifelong love of the 30s, I bought into it. Hard. Comics, toys, posters, the soundtrack, reprints of the original newspaper strips. I wound up gaining a massive appreciation for the character and his history. So, when I was at Jumbo Video with my mom and discovered that there was a Dick Tracy NES game, remember, the internet wasn't a thing, I had to play it. We rented it that weekend, and I excitedly popped it into my NES as soon as I got home. I was greeted with the title screen, which presented a decent approximation of not just the silhouette logo from the movie poster, but also the scene from the movie where Flat Top machine guns Tracy's name into a brick wall. I started the game, read the first clue, checked which criminal was the best suspect, and hit the streets. And promptly got gunned down on said streets. I couldn't figure out how to stop the snipers from shooting me, and I had no instructions to guide me. The game rental didn't come with the proper manual. Instead, it came with this guy. This is a permastruct instruction sheet. These would be stuck to the inside of rental cases because video rental places would regularly deal with lost or stolen official manuals, and you couldn't do that with these. They were, more often than not, practically useless, but they were there. Which is something, I guess? Such was the case here. Okay, so after figuring out on my own that the select button allowed me to get out of the car and shoot at the snipers, I picked up on the street naming system and made it to my first investigation scene, at which point I got stuck again. I could not figure out how to enter the building. Nothing seemed to be working, and the permastruct manual was, unsurprisingly, no help whatsoever. So there I was, stuck outside the building with no help and no way to progress in the game. That was it. That was my entire experience with Dick Tracy. I knew that there were side-scrolling sections in the game because they were shown on the back of the box, but I never got to see them. I was infuriated because I'd been so excited for that game. We took it back to the rental store that day, complained, and got a different game rental instead. It wouldn't be until the late 90s, when stores were selling used NES games, 3 for $10, and yeah, I'm not making that up, that I would encounter Dick Tracy again, and finally figure out how to play it. My problem all those years ago had been with the placement of my car. It was blocking the entrance, and I had no way of knowing. Now, here's the thing. Figuring out how to play it, I realized what the game was attempting to do, and came to appreciate the attempt, if not the execution. First, the NES game was not the only Dick Tracy game to be released. There were games for the Game Boy, Sega Master System, Genesis, and MS-DOS. The last of which was produced by Titus of Superman 64 fame. From what I can tell, and in contradiction to the Wikipedia page on the subject, the DOS game is just a worse remake of the NES game. The others, though, were simple run-and-gun arcade-style shooters. There's little to distinguish Dick Tracy on the Genesis and Master System from, say, The Punisher in his NES game. The Game Boy game takes the side-scrolling sections of the NES game and strips them of any context. Yeah, you collect clues in the form of photo fragments, but that is the closest to actual detective work that the player is tasked with. The Dick Tracy NES game is different in multiple ways, however, and is, surprisingly, better for it. First, the goal of the game is not to simply gun down as many people on screen as possible. Dick Tracy is a detective, which means that so is the player. You need to solve crimes, not just, well, commit them via wholesale murder. This means gathering clues, following the evidence, and arresting the correct suspect. Evidence is key here as well. Sure, if you know ahead of time who the culprit for a particular case is, you can head right over and try to arrest him. And spoiler, the criminal is always a guy. Breathless Mahoney's only crime is not looking anything like Madonna. Or being played by Madonna, depending on your perspective. But without evidence to back up that arrest, he'll be out of jail and you'll be berated by Police Chief Brandon. You need to actually think like a cop to succeed. This is not to say that there is no gunplay in NES Dick Tracy. Far from it. Even here though, the game makes the player behave not just like a cop, but a semi-responsible one. If a thug is shooting at you, and you respond in kind, that's fine. You're simply defending yourself. If an assailant comes at you fists flying and you shoot him, however, you get penalized. Some of your very limited health bar is taken away as a result of you using excessive force. You also don't get the unlimited bullets of the Dick Tracy games on other systems. This game wants you to be aware of each bullet you use, even if it's justified. What's more, the environment comes into play during the action as well. Bad guys can take cover behind furniture, crates, and so on, forcing you to move around these obstacles in order to stop them. Yes, this is a cover-based shooter, 15 years before they became the norm. I did say semi-responsible because Dick Tracy is still being characterized as a two-fisted detective. You either knock thugs out or gun them down. The only arrests you make in the game come from interrogation scenes. Tied to this, Tracy's Super Punch power-up doesn't carry the weight of the other fighting options in the game, but is an interesting interpretation of some of the hyperbole from the movie. The scene where Tracy throws a single punch and knocks out a group of mobsters, for example. This move sends the thug it connects with spinning across the screen, taking out any other thugs he comes into contact with. If you can keep the screen scrolling enough, you can take massive advantage of this in a gameplay sense. Tracy is still a comic strip character after all, and while not in the least realistic, it does offer perspective on the comic realism of the original strip and the movie. On that note, the game does offer enough tie-ins to the movie to justify calling it a movie-based game. Climbing up poles like the Club Ritz scene in the movie? Check. Escaping boiler rooms? Check. Hotels like the one Tracy gets framed in? Check. The docks where Tracy and Breathless meet? Check. All of these aspects of the movie are included, but are represented as recurring game mechanics rather than one-time set pieces. The game is more interested in giving the player the feel of the world created by the movie, rather than a one-to-one recreation of the movie's events, which I can appreciate. Even the dialogue scenes offer the same, not quite from the movie, but of the movie style, with Breathless constantly flirting with Tracy, while Big Boy plays innocent, but with a threatening tone. The game also goes above and beyond the movie, surprisingly fixing two of the sins committed by the film it was based off of. It would not be out of line to say that there were perhaps too many characters crammed into the film. So much so that many of the more unique villains were reduced to generic gangster figures, just with grotesque appearances. For example, the opening scene casually wipes out 5 characters who could have been main villains in their own right, given the chance. The game, however, in trying to promote the characters in the movie, reasserts the personalities and idiosyncrasies of the individual mobsters and villains. The Brow, for example, rather than simply being a henchman who is gunned down with little context, is described as a spy and saboteur in the game's mug sheet, and the clues point toward this. Likewise, Influence, rather than being just a visually interesting background character, is given back his interest and expertise in hypnosis, just as during his appearance in the original comic strip. Not every character gets a prominent role, but they are given more personality than the majority of them receive in the film. Tied to this, the film had enough interesting characters present for something like 6 films worth of storylines, if they had been utilized properly. Since the game doesn't have a specific runtime it needs to adhere to, it can build to the confrontation with Big Boy without glossing over the crimes or detective work involved in dismantling his organization. There are 5 cases overall in the game, and, on the surface, they don't seem to have anything in common. Taken as a whole, though, it shows the methodical way in which the police would have to approach taking down an organized crime syndicate in a large city, one operation at a time. You as a player move up the ranks of Big Boy's subordinates, imprisoning them for crimes you can prove they've committed, until you are able to properly go after the head of the mob, Big Boy himself, who is also the only arrestable criminal to actively fight back, which makes sense because he is the end boss of the game. Or really, the only boss in the game. The upside of this is that those same characters who are given their personalities back also get their day in the sun in terms of narrative, as they become suspects or perpetrators in individual stories in their own right, while still contributing to an overarching narrative, instead of remaining as background characters or nondescript henchmen. At this point, let's be clear about something. So far, it seems like I'm gushing about this game, making it sound like an underrated gem. I am gushing about the concepts in the game. Actually playing Dick Tracy is a chore. There's a reason it's such an internet punching bag. Minute to minute, there are numerous flaws in the gameplay. In the side-scrolling sections, hitboxes for both Tracy and the Thugsy fights are often awkwardly defined. The platform jumping is woefully inaccurate yet absolutely necessary, which is especially frustrating on the piers. Using the first aid kit is unnecessarily complicated. You need to hit select and B almost, but not quite simultaneously. And the placement of gunmen and their rate of fire in the later cases becomes blatantly unfair. I am not ashamed to say that I took full advantage of save state spamming in order to capture footage of the later levels, because look at this. As for the driving segments, the criticisms aren't necessarily what you'd expect. Yeah, the snipers are a royal pain, but here's the thing. Once you shoot them, they don't respawn. At all. For the rest of the game. If you spend the first case or two methodically eliminating them as you go, you can drive through the city in the later cases almost without incident. I say almost because there are still other cars to contend with, and they seem to be oblivious to your existence, despite the fact that you're driving a police car with the lights constantly flashing. This combined with the game absolutely refusing to let you drive outside of the proper lane, which, yeah, you're keeping to the lawful lanes like a proper officer of the law, but you also have your lights going, which should legally provide some leeway, means that you will take damage while driving, which should have been avoidable. Being forced to stay in the proper lane is also a problem in the car chase segments, since that means that you simply cannot dodge the gunfire coming from the car you're chasing. No swerving, no sudden turns, you're stuck taking that damage. There's also no indication of how close you are to causing the suspect vehicle to come crashing to a stop, and running into the vehicle while it is spinning out will still damage you, again making these segments unnecessarily punishing. I did find a few little tricks to make managing the game a little easier. Things that, again, were never mentioned in the Permastruct manual. First, if you're on the streets and running low on health or handgun bullets, go to your nearest police station. All of your handgun bullets will be restored, along with some of your health. This health trick has its limit though. If you are at 3 full badges or more, visiting the police station won't refill anymore. Also, if you find a location that has a particularly useful item, and don't mind taking your time, the items repopulate each time you go into that location. I used this to get the 5 maximum first aid kits from the pier in the 4th case, especially since falling in the water sends you back to the streets instead of killing you. None of this mitigates how straight up broken the final confrontation against Big Boy is, though. Not only does Big Boy have a ridiculous rate of fire, but he's hiding behind several pieces of cover. You either take some hits trying to get close to him, or you hit furniture instead of him. I tried creeping forward so that he appears on screen but doesn't start firing, which is a tactic that works for other gun-toting enemies in the game. It worked in that he didn't start firing at me, but after taking 4 shots, no matter what I did, the game would instantly kill me for some reason. This is another instance where I will absolutely admit to using save states, because of how broken the fight is. Eventually, I managed to luck into a position where, not wanting to risk using the gun, I could punch at him without him hurting me, which allowed me to actually defeat him, as you see here. This came after try, after try, after try, after try. I honestly do not know how anyone was able to beat this game back when it came out. Mind you, I also don't personally know anyone who has had the patience to beat this game, period. Dick Tracy for the NES is definitely not an underappreciated, underrated gem. On the other hand, it isn't a complete disaster on the level of something like Action 52 or Back to the Future. It's a game with several interesting premises and gameplay systems, which feels like it was rushed to market to coincide with the theatrical run of the film whose license it bears. So, a typical licensed NES game. The potential present in Dick Tracy is clearly visible. It just feels like the ideas on offer wouldn't be realized for another 21 years, until the release of L.A. Noire, despite that game's, let's be generous and call it, troubled development cycle. If you have the patience to handle the minute-to-minute gameplay, then I would still recommend giving Dick Tracy a play to check out the potential for what could have been. Once you know what the game expects of the player and what it's trying to accomplish, it makes for a good weekend rental.
(1988's) Godzilla Monster of Monsters for the Nintendo Entertainment System defied and/or undermined expectations, as well as promises made about it by its own publisher. Much like the film that spawned the franchise, it may be somewhat smarter than people give it credit for. I'm Matt Kondracki, sitting in for Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental. We look at games that, while not classics or sometimes even good, are still worth examining, and maybe even playing despite themselves. Before we dive in, Chris discovered the novel-sized text meme known as a creepypasta surrounding Godzilla Monster of Monsters. If you tuned in hoping for an examination of a dead meme, we're not going to dig into that corner of the internet today. Now let's start with those broken promises. Imagine it's 1988 and you're browsing Nintendo games stocked across the shelves at the corner store. You pick up the box for Godzilla Monster of Monsters, and you are struck by the awe-inspiring box art. It screams destruction and mayhem. It's so compelling that Game Player's Strategy Guide to Nintendo Games featured an expanded version of it as the cover for their February-March 1990 issue. The back of the box hypes up the game even further, with phrases like 8 planets, 7 places to attack, 10 different horrifying monsters, and it's so big, you've never played anything like it. Looking at that striking box art and the claims made, you would naturally assume the cartridge holds the keys to crushing cities under your heel and slapping around giant monsters. You know, Godzilla things. Enamored by the art and the promises of monstrous destruction, you walk out of the store and pop the game into your NES. It's time for stomping. Now when a player loads Godzilla, they're greeted with astonishingly good pixel art of Godzilla himself and adrenaline-pumping music. Pressing start leads to an opening cinematic outlining the plot, which falls somewhere between 1965's Godzilla vs. Monster Zero and 1968's Destroy All Monsters. In a bid for conquest, invaders from Planet X have stationed giant monsters on planets across the solar system, and the Earth has sent Godzilla and Mothra to defeat them all. So far, so good, right? Then the game starts. Godzilla and Mothra are hardly the terrifying forces of nature you'd expect from the box you saw on the store shelf. Instead, they look like miniature versions of themselves. The excitement of giant monsters starts to drift away when you look like Polly Pocket Kaiju Edition. The box suggested a gameplay experience similar to Midway's Rampage, but let's check the back of the box again. What's going on here? This part of the game isn't mentioned or shown at all in the packaging. Why is a game about Godzilla like this? This is why. Or to be more accurate, this is why. This is Dragon Quest, known as Dragon Warrior when it came to North America in 1989. But how does a 1989 Japanese RPG, or JRPG, released a year after Godzilla, leave us with this? This is all because Japanese games took years to arrive in North America until the early 2000s. In Japan, Dragon Quest's 1986 release triggered a phenomenon and single-handedly established the JRPG formula, a formula crystallized by Final Fantasy in 1987. Dragon Quest's influence on Japanese video games cannot be overstated. Elements of its gameplay show up in many games that have become global franchises. It's no coincidence that Castlevania II: Simon's Quest features non-linear exploration, an experience points-based system, and an inventory management system complete with currency. It's also the only NES Castlevania game with hit points in mind for the monsters. It's telling that Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, released a year after Dragon Quest, is the only game in the series to offer random encounters in the overworld, towns with shops and places for Link to heal, a leveling system, hit points, and a magic system. Dragon Quest is very likely the reason why Monsters prominently features a hex grid, which we'll circle back to in a bit. DQ's influence can also be seen in the leveling system. As Godzilla and Mothra make their ways across each map, they gain experience points, leveling up after they've caused enough destruction, either in the regular side-scrolling stages or by defeating enemy monsters. There is a small problem with this leveling system. You can't see it. The manual tells players it's there, but doesn't say how it's measured or how they can keep track of leveling up, because they can't. There's no way to tell when you're going to level up. The game has no interface to tell the player how many experience points either Godzilla or Mothra have, or how many they need to get to the next experience level. This all happens behind the scenes, or off camera, I guess. But why would Godzilla and Mothra need to level up to begin with? The answer lies in the hex grid. While the hex map is clearly representative of a world map, the game tells the player exactly which world each grid is supposed to be beforehand. It is not a world map in the same sense as something like Super Mario Bros. 3. Instead, and this is where Godzilla Monsters really gets interesting, this hex grid functions much like a turn-based strategy game. Yes, miniature Godzilla and Mothra move across the hex map, but then they have to stomp through side-scrolling stages represented by each hex. The number of stages a player must conquer is set by the number of hexes they cross and change depending on the kind of hex. Looking closely at the hexes on the world maps, or the game manual, you can tell which stages are represented in each hex, so the player knows exactly what they're about to smash their way through. Playing into the strategy aspect of the gameplay, players don't have to fight an entire planet/map to win. Their goal is to land on and hold the enemy base, indicated by a unique terrain hex. In fact, both the manual and the game player's strategy guide to Nintendo games suggest that fighting all the monsters may not be the best strategy for progressing through the game. However, if you want to level up Godzilla and Mothra to be their baddest selves, defeating all the monsters is the most efficient way to level up. The JRPG influences don't stop at the map design. Godzilla and Mothra each have their unique abilities affecting their gameplay. Godzilla is a lumbering damage sponge, able to just soak up a lot of what stages throw at him without being knocked back. This durability comes at a movement cost, as he can only move 2 spaces in the hex grid each turn. On the other hand, Mothra is a far more delicate character who takes damage from attacks that Godzilla would shrug off, and regularly suffers knockback from regular stage attacks. However, Mothra possesses the ability to cover significantly more ground through flight, allowing her to cross 4 hexes each turn. These side-scrolling stages, combined with the hex grid, the leveling system, and the individual monsters' abilities, reveal the true nature of the game: a turn-based strategy beat-em-up. A turn-based strategy beat-em-up is an intriguing idea, but the mix of genres led to awkward design choices that make Godzilla Monsters less engaging than it should be. Let's take a look at those stage types. It is great that there are 7 types of terrain, which should mean there are 7 types of side-scrolling levels with plenty of variety, right? Not so much. There are maps and levels for each of the planets in the solar system, minus Venus and Mercury, plus Planet X when Godzilla and Mothra take the fight to the invaders. Each of the 8 planets consist of dozens of hex spaces, repeating those 7 stage types. It gets repetitive quickly, as a few of them are only revealed in the later levels. It's never explained how the Earth's heroic monsters travel from planet to planet, or how Mothra flies in the vacuum of space on Jupiter. Then again, those are probably the wrong questions to ask of a game where giant lizards and moths shoot laser beams out of their mouths. Those stages have a lot going on in them. You've got radar tanks, actual tanks, satellite dishes that shoot electricity, fighter jets, weird plant things, different weird plant things, UFOs, alien ruins with defense systems, alien tentacle things, firebirds, dragon things, giant brains that spew fireballs, and stuff. There's so much thrown at the player, especially in the later stages, that the poor NES can't handle everything on screen. Sprite flicker and slowdown become a very real problem. Monsters pushes the NES hard. The side-scrolling sprites for all of the monsters, player-controlled or otherwise, are suitably massive and impressive. It's understandable that the fights between Godzilla or Mothra and the enemy monsters happen on black backgrounds, because those sprites must already be taxing the NES's capabilities as is. This is what was promised on the back of the box. There's one other problem with the side-scrolling stages. This thing. I don't know what this fireball is or where it came from, but it is the most dangerous object in the game. Sure, King Ghidorah, Gigan, and Mechagodzilla are all powerhouses, but this thing, this ball of hate and flame, can kill you in a matter of seconds. If it connects just right, it will drag you across the screen while draining your health meter and end your game very quickly. I'm not sure why Godzilla and Mothra are so vulnerable to it, but it's a reality the player has to deal with on stages. There's exactly 0 warning about it in the game manual or the game player's strategy guide article about the game. So chances are your first encounter with the flames of hate will probably go something like this. This isn't much of a setback, to be honest. Godzilla Monsters is actually pretty generous when it comes to losing. If either Godzilla or Mothra fall in battle, and the other monsters on the same world. As long as they can get to the enemy base and move on to the next world, the fallen monster will return at the beginning of the next level. There is a weird unexplained exception. If either Godzilla or Mothra have already moved on to the next world, and the other monster falls, it is an immediate game over. But receiving a game over is far less punishing than many other NES games of that era. Upon getting a game over, the player can just continue by choosing Last Game from the main menu screen, and will immediately be taken back to the last planet they were on. Sure, progress on that planet will be lost, and all the defeated monsters will be back, but it's a lot more forgiving than Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Toho also made some odd decisions for the monsters you face. Let's look at the lineup. First, we get Gazora and Megara on Earth, Varan on Mars, Hedorah on Jupiter, Baragon on Saturn, Gigan on Uranus, Mechagodzilla on Pluto, and Planet X has the player confront King Ghidorah. The reason why this roster is odd is because half of these monsters have never fought Godzilla before, and hadn't when this game was made. Sure, Baragon and Varan have cameos and destroy all monsters, but they never actually fought Godzilla, at least not by the point at which the game was released. Gazora and Megara had never even appeared in a Godzilla movie at that point. Gazora was one of the monsters from Space Amoeba, and Megara is a giant robot from the Mysterians. It's unclear why these monsters, both hailing from movies from the same production company as Godzilla, Toho, were chosen other than to fill out the roster of baddies for Godzilla and Mothra to fight. The fights against these monsters share another odd feature. They sometimes break the gameplay. Gazora has a weird cornering attack, which, while vaguely disconcerting to watch, does not actually cause Godzilla harm. Meanwhile, Mothra will take damage from Gazora, which makes Godzilla the obvious choice for the fight. Godzilla can also lay waste to Hedorah with relative ease, while Mothra suffers knockback from shooting Hedorah's smog projectiles. On the flip side, most of the monsters with a beam attack have a weak point that Mothra can just hover over and attack with impunity, outside the range of their physical and beam attacks below. This means that Megara, Gigan, Mechagodzilla, and King Ghidorah are all relatively helpless when fighting her, whereas Godzilla is much too large to avoid these attacks. These character-specific advantages offer a form of strategy in the game, making sure you're using the right monster for the confrontation at a suitable experience level so you can defeat them before the timer runs out and they flee to the next planet. Yes, the fights are timed. It makes sense in the context of a strategy game. Each side needs an opportunity to choose what its course of action will be, and a time limit is really the only way to do that in beat-em-up style combat. Enemies can recover health if you take more than one turn to continue the fight with them, but, and here's the thing, so do your monsters. If, for example, Godzilla needs a breather while you're fighting an enemy encounter, Mothra can tag in for a round or two against the same monster, and Godzilla will recover some health while he's benched. Godzilla Monsters mashup of genres and scale of monster versus monster fights is odd, especially considering the limited power of the NES. The choice of enemy monsters is odd, the way in which it was sold to North American audiences was odd, the sometimes lopsided monster fights are odd, but odd doesn't necessarily mean bad or not fun. It is not as odd or misleading as Godzilla for the Game Boy, a chibi action puzzle game where you punch blocks. Yeah. Although Monster of Monsters may get repetitive in long sessions, it's a game that blended a strategy RPG into a beat-em-up in an era that saw a few games attempt to reach beyond simple platforming and puzzles, which makes it a good weekend rental.
These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise.
Star Trek: The Next Generation for the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's an ambitious game, In fact, it could be argued that it is overly ambitious for the hardware that it's on. At the same time, there are certain aspects where it could also be argued that it is not ambitious enough. This is Velvet Wells. I'm a musical improv comedian with the Dandies. We are in our 8th season of Holodeck Follies, where we make up a new Star Trek episode in front of live audiences. I'm guest narrating for Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not classics or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. While the game itself is interesting, for both its ambitions and shortcomings, the circumstances surrounding its release are also noteworthy for their unusual nature. First, the game was released in 1993, 2 years after Konami's Ultra's release of Star Trek 25th Anniversary for the NES. A TNG game coming out after a game based on the original series doesn't seem that unusual, right? What is unusual, though, is the timing in relation to the NES itself. The NES was released in select markets in North America in 1985, followed by a wide release in 1986. Star Trek The Next Generation's first episode aired on September 28, 1987, leading to a successful 7-season run ending in 1994. What this means is that despite both the show and the NES being successful for 6 years beforehand, the NES only got a TNG game just a year before the show's cancellation. In other words, it came a little late to the party. The other unusual aspect of its release is that it's not the original version of the game, or even the most ambitious version of it. The game was originally released for the Game Boy earlier that same year, and the NES version is an updated port of that game with additional missions, making it the definitive version. This situation is unusual for two reasons. First, it goes in reverse of the way games were usually ported between the NES and Game Boy. Typically, a game would release on the NES before being ported to the smaller resolution, less powerful Game Boy. That the Game Boy is less powerful is the other reason why this situation is unusual. The developers attempted to make a fully functioning first-person starship simulator on the Game Boy. The original Game Boy. With randomly generated missions, the sheer audacity and ambition of this notion is mind-boggling. This ambition carries over to the NES game as well. Both the Game Boy and NES games look like they share a common point of inspiration. While there doesn't appear to be concrete documentation to this effect, aspects of both the gameplay and visuals of the game seem to have taken their cues from Sega's Star Trek Strategic Operations Simulator arcade game from 1983. Released the same year as Atari's Star Wars arcade game, Star Trek shares that game's vector graphics and cockpit perspective. What Star Trek does differently, however, is give the player an open area in which to fight off Klingon battlecruisers instead of guiding the player along a set course. Interestingly, despite being released a year after Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, the game seems to have taken its art direction from the original motion picture instead. This goes so far as to be seen in the sit-down versions of the cabinet, which models the command chair from the first movie surprisingly accurately. Despite this seeming lineage, Star Trek The Next Generation is actually more ambitious than its arcade forebear. Sega's game, while offering multiple perspectives, including a first-person one, only allows for 2D movement. An interesting choice considering the cause of Khan's downfall the year prior. TNG, on the other hand, actually tries to approximate 3D space on significantly less powerful hardware, no less. It doesn't quite succeed. Instead, it offers tiers of elevation without giving a full 360 degrees of vertical movement, making movement feel like it's constrained in a torus rather than full 3D space. The attempt, however, is admirable. What's equally impressive, if not more so, is the way in which Star Trek The Next Generation simulates the first-person perspective. This is not in reference to the movement through stars, which looks like the Windows 95 screensaver, but instead how the game presents objects moving through space via the main view screen. Going back to the arcade game, Scaling things like ships and starbases was relatively easy for the arcade hardware because it was vector-based. Not working with pixels allows for smooth scaling. The NES, on the other hand, is entirely sprite-based and does not have the Mode 7 scaling capabilities of its successor, the Super NES. Because of this, every ship, planet, meteor, starbase, and even photon torpedo needed its own set of sprites for different distant ranges. Long range, where it's just a speck. Medium long range, where it's larger than a speck, but still just a jumble of pixels. Medium close range, where details are clearly discernible, but it's still a ways off. And close range, where everything is as visible as it's going to get. Then, there are the additional sprites necessary for the ships to indicate movement and turning angles. This doesn't even take into account the impressive minigame used to establish orbit over a planet for the Enterprise. Again, the ambition is laudable. Then there are the missions themselves. What is interesting about these is that there is no set series of missions that players must progress through, as mentioned with the Game Boy. All of the missions are randomly generated. This is because, rather than piloting the Enterprise itself, the game indicates in the manual that all of the proceedings are a holodeck simulation. That is why you get initial mission briefings from Picard, taking the captain's chair as yourself rather than stepping into his shoes. It's an interesting conceit, but takes away from the immediacy of the proceedings just a little. More often than not, these missions involve fighting enemy ships, but there are also missions involving providing ambassadors with safe passage, rescuing stranded colonists, destroying dangerous asteroids, delivering life-saving equipment and supplies, and so on. The game even openly shows the player some of the databases that it is pulling mission parameters from. When talking to Data to prepare for warp travel, there is a list of planets offered as possible destinations. This list is clearly the list of potential mission locations. Sometimes this can lead to absurdly off-brand win conditions, such as this instance, in which the game has decided that a science team needs to be rescued from Bajor before an asteroid destroys it. The mission goal is not to save Bajor from the asteroid, which is actually a mission type in the game, just not here. Here, you are just expected to save the small group of people indicated. Considering the importance of the planet Bajor and its people to both Star Trek The Next Generation and especially Star Trek Deep Space Nine, just casually allowing Bajor to be destroyed is unintentionally hilarious. Another potential mission parameter is revealed when looking at the 3 options that the player can choose from with Chief O'Brien. In addition to beaming up and beaming down, there is an intruder control option indicating that intruders may, in fact, board the Enterprise during a given excursion. Here is where the game starts to go into the weeds, though. Yes, intruders can board the Enterprise during missions. It is one of the variables the game uses to construct increasingly more complex and therefore more challenging missions for the player. The thing is that it is a random variable occurrence and it kind of breaks the rules of Star Trek when it occurs. Rules that the game enforces for the player. When the player is trying to use the transporter, regardless of beaming up or down, the Enterprise's shields must be lowered. If they are still up, O'Brien will inform the player that they must be lowered in order for the transporter to function. This is in keeping with the rules of Star Trek going back to the original series in the 60s. The intruders, on the other hand, seem to have no such restriction placed on them. They are able to board with the Enterprise's shields up and at full strength. How they are doing it is never explained or justified, they just are. Expanding on this, there are multiple random variables which can occur during a mission, seemingly without cause, and they can quickly get overwhelming and ridiculous. For instance, this mission saw 3 ships in combat with the Enterprise. Suddenly, intruders boarded the ship, again while the shields were up, sabotaging systems. While this is occurring, the life support systems start to fail, requiring a rerouting of power to get them back online. Keep in mind that All of this is occurring in real time, and unlike with a real crew, the player cannot delegate. All of these situations must be dealt with one at a time via gameplay. In this case, the Enterprise wound up being destroyed by the hostile ships while trying to reroute the power to the life support systems. Now, having the life support systems fail due to a combination of damage from attacking ships and internal sabotage from intruders makes sense. It is a logical progression of attrition during this overwhelming situation. What is not, though, is this scenario in which LaForge announces that the life support systems are once again failing. This time, the ship has not sustained any noticeable damage, as confirmed by LaForge himself, and there are no intruders to cause this. It just randomly happened, right near the end of the mission in question. Arguably, this could just be taken as a glitch, right? There is no indication that the life support systems are actually in danger, so I'll be fine, right? Nope. Rather than finishing the mission successfully, the Phantom life support failure killed everyone on board, despite meeting all the mission completion parameters. Speaking of killing everyone on board, let's talk about the main mission type in the game, ship-to-ship combat. Ship-to-ship combat is both the most ambitious part of the game and, paradoxically, not ambitious enough. As discussed, the game does its best to offer the player the experience of 3D space, both in the sprites for the enemy ships and the movement of the Enterprise itself. It should be mentioned here that, despite offering this 3D attempt, the 2D sensor screen is invaluable for determining where enemy ships are in relation to the Enterprise because of the torus effect of the Enterprise's movements mentioned earlier. Having said that, when tasked with one of these missions, the player is given only two options: destroy the enemy ship outright, or disable it, and beam out the covert agent the Federation has on board, or the rogue aliens who hijacked the ship in the first place. More often than not, though, the player is just expected to destroy the enemy ships and move on. This gameplay loop seems to fly in the face of what Star Trek: The Next Generation was all about. There is no diplomacy here. There are no negotiations. There are no conditions for surrender. Either the Enterprise destroys the enemy ships, or the enemy ships destroy the Enterprise. In fact, let's have a look at the options available to Data at the helm. There are options for setting a course using warp drive, checking the ship sensors, and establishing orbit. There is no hailing option or any other options for communication whatsoever. The game does not offer any way to avoid combat, one of the major drives of the TV show. In fact, doing the same thing video games have done since Space Invaders, destroying the other. While we're discussing crew options and ways the game falls short of the series, let's take another look at the crew available to the player, shall we? Left to right, we have Worf on battle systems. Okay, makes sense. Data at the helm. Again, makes sense, and at least it's not Wesley. LaForge handling engineering. 3 for 3 so far. O'Brien handling the transporter. A little odd, since at this point he has moved over to DS9, but sure, fine, we'll take it. And Rygar, who essentially acts as the game's quest log and timer. Seems like a solid lineup, so what's the problem here? A couple of things, actually. First, where is the sickbay option? The player is tasked with transporting ambassadors, covert operatives, rescued officers, prisoners from disabled ships, and refugees. None of them sustained injuries or need other medical attention? Why isn't Dr. Crusher on call here, or even Dr. Pulaski? That game didn't need the frankly annoying power rerouting minigame assigned to LaForge, so that space could have been given over to a medical scan operation treatment minigame featuring the good doctor. This criticism could be expanded further as well. One of Star Trek's main tenets across all of its iterations is the drive for diversity, despite some questionable episodes in the first season of TNG. One of the Vulcan credos is infinite diversity in infinite combinations, after all. Despite this, the crew made available to the players kind of one-sided. It's dudes. It's all made up of dudes. Yeah, we can ask where is Dr. Crusher, but we can also ask where is Deanna Troi. Both are on the cover art for the game, so why aren't they there? In the game itself? Troy could have been invaluable in the missions where the player needs to disable enemy ships. She could have monitored enemy crew anxiety and notified the player when the ship was disabled, something the game doesn't actively do, which makes it far too easy to accidentally destroy ships instead of disabling them. Oh, and that idea for communications option mentioned earlier, why couldn't Rolaren be given that task? The game does acknowledge her existence, but only as a password to save progression. The passwords even reference Sela, Tasha Yar's half-Romulan daughter, so why couldn't at least one woman have an actual role in the game? Speaking of passwords, they are another source of frustration in the game. Sure, the missions are randomly generated, but the complexity of said missions increases as the player makes progress. The problem is that the game gives out a new password after every 4 successfully completed excursions. If the player fails any of the missions at a given rank, that 4 completion tally resets, and the player is forced to play through 4 new randomly generated missions in order to progress. This is especially frustrating during the last mission of the game, which is not randomly generated. Instead, the player is confronted by a Borg ship, which the Enterprise has no hope of defeating on its own. The player must warp back to Earth for a virus which will destroy the Borg ship. The Borg ship, for its part, follows the Enterprise to Earth, and the player must destroy it before Earth is assimilated into the Borg collective. This mission is ludicrously difficult, and during this playthrough led to numerous defeats, resetting the 4-mission quota. In other words, failing to defeat the Borg means the player has to make it through 3 more missions before being able to try again, despite the password system. Also, about fighting that Borg ship, any ship-to-ship tactics developed to this point just fall apart in the face of the Borg's onslaught. Their cube ship is ridiculously fast and powerful, and the player needs to weaken their shields enough to beam the virus aboard to defeat them. With most of the enemy ships in the game, the player can attempt strafing runs, getting some distance between the Enterprise and its opponent before turning around and mounting an offense. Not here though. Trying that against the Borg will actually get the Enterprise destroyed faster while mounting less of an offense. The best tactic seems to just be sitting still and throwing whatever the Enterprise has at the ship. The best attempt from this playthrough was just sitting still and hitting the Borg with photon torpedoes and phasers, until damage done to the Enterprise disabled the photon torpedoes and left just phasers to attack with. This went on for 20 minutes with no discernible movement or damage done to the Borg ship before just calling it quits. Strategy. Finally, I hope you like both the Jerry Goldsmith Star Trek theme used for TNG as well as the ambient noise of the Enterprise's bridge, because you'll be hearing both a lot. All of the very limited music in the game is based off of Goldsmith's piece, making it all variations of a theme literally. Despite all this, there are still good experiences to be had with Star Trek The Next Generation for the NES. The ambitious game design is clearly noticeable and is made all the more impressive by the fact that the game was created by a team of just 8 people. At the same time, the shortcomings of the game can also be largely explained by the fact that the game was created by a team of just 8 people, only one of whom was a woman. Keep in mind, that's explained, not justified. As a result, it makes for a good weekend rental.
Resident Evil Survivor.
Resident Evil Survivor for the Sony PlayStation holds a unique place in the Resident Evil series timeline, while also serving as a snapshot of the era in which it was produced. It is at once a cynical cash grab, a reflection of concerns at the time, a reference to the origins of the Resident Evil series, as well as a hint of things to come, and secretly, possibly, the darkest game in the franchise. This is Ashley Cooper, I'm a game writer and Twitch streamer, and I'm guest narrating for Makopowered. Welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. Because context is a major key to putting Resident Evil Survivor in perspective, let's set the stage. Released in the year 2000, Resident Evil Survivor is the first spin-off for the Resident Evil franchise. Sort of. In a 2012 interview with ProjectUmbrella.net, Yasuhisa Kawamura, the scenario writer for Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, revealed that the game that players know as Resident Evil 3 actually started out as a spin-off starring a new character as the protagonist, titled Resident Evil Last Escape, and that Resident Evil Code Veronica for the Sega Dreamcast was intended to be a true numbered entry to the franchise. Due to a licensing contract between Capcom and Sony, however, numbered sequels for the series were obligated to appear on the PlayStation. As a result, the main character was changed to Jill Valentine from the first Resident Evil. The story was reworked because of that change, and it was released as Resident Evil 3 in 1999. This reworking left Survivor, which was also in development at the time, as the first true spin-off to be released for the series. Because it was a spin-off, Survivor didn't need to be tied to the conventions and gameplay mechanics of the main series. Instead, what was planned was a first-person light gun game that was equal parts Resident Evil and Sega's House of the Dead series, which is ironic since House of the Dead was riding on the coattails of Resident Evil's success when it was released back in 1996. This fusion concept didn't exactly happen, but we'll get to that in a moment. First, the idea of a first-person Resident Evil game may seem like a major departure for the series, especially at the time. After all, one of the hallmarks of the PlayStation 1 era Resident Evil games is their cinematic fixed camera angle presentation. Yet, Survivor is less of a departure for the series than it is a return to the original concept. See, early in production of the original Resident Evil, back in 1995, the game started as a first-person survival horror game before Shinji Mikami and Tokuro Fujiwara realized that the PlayStation simply wasn't capable of handling the kind of horror experience they were envisioning. The technical limitations of the PlayStation are why the series went with the fixed camera angles and tank controls that were its hallmark in the 32-bit era. Now, before it seems like we're saying that Survivor is the embodiment of some grand ideal or returning to an artistic vision, it should be pointed out that the game was definitely intended to be a quick and dirty cash grab. All of the enemy sprites, except for the final boss of the game, are reused assets from Resident Evil 2. The zombies, the lickers, the Cerberus dogs, the giant spiders, the hunters, the giant alligator, the plant things, the giant moth, even Mr. X gets reused here to a surprising degree. There are no puzzles to speak of, items to unlock progression are found and immediately used when needed with no input from the player, doors are open just by walking into them, the environments are sparse and frankly nonsensical as anything other than shooter corridors, plus they're dark. Not in an atmospheric, spooky, what's around the next corner kind of sense, but in a we're trying to obscure how little there actually is here kind of sense. The game was clearly supposed to be a quick and easy production to tide players over until something more substantial came down the pipeline. So what's the problem? Why did it go awry? Because on April 20th, 1999, two teenagers walked into Columbine High School in Columbine, Colorado, and gunned down 12 students and one teacher, injured 21 additional people with gunfire, and then committed suicide before they could be apprehended by police. At the time, it was the deadliest mass shooting in US history. In the wake of this tragedy, people, understandably distraught over what happened, tried to figure out why and how such a thing could occur. One of the concerns circled around to the fact that the shooters played games like Doom, Doom 2, and Quake, and went so far as to make their own levels for the game modeled after the high school. This led to a reopening of the violence in video games debate in the media, along with several in-development games having aspects changed as a result of those circumstances. For example, Perfect Dark for the Nintendo 64 originally planned to offer compatibility with the Game Boy camera, where players could photograph themselves and their friends and map those photographs onto character models for multiplayer games. In light of the shooting, however, it was seen as being in poor taste for players to literally be shooting each other in-game. This is also why Resident Evil Survivor has the control scheme it does. While the Japanese version of the game does have light gun support, it was removed in the North American release out of sensitivity for the video game violence issue. What North American players got instead was an odd mashup of a first-person shooter and traditional Resident Evil controls. When the player wants to fire at a monster, they need to hold the shoulder button on the PlayStation controller, which roots them on the spot while they aim with the reticle on screen. Yes, this setup is cumbersome, but there is some assistance provided. As soon as the player scores a successful hit on the monster, as long as they keep the shoulder button held down, the target is locked on. In some cases, this is absolutely necessary. The Cerberus dogs would be impossible to eliminate without aim assistance present. It's an interesting mapping of Resident Evil combat controls onto a first-person shooter. It's not entirely successful, but it does hint at the way combat would work eventually in Resident Evil 4. The two are almost identical, aside from the camera perspective and aim assist. What is a departure from the series norms, though, is that the handgun the player starts out with has unlimited ammo, clearly a vestige of the game's light gun roots. This unlimited ammo, combined with the fact that there is no way to manually reload, leads to weird things like intentionally firing bullets at nothing in between fights, so that the player isn't caught flat-footed by the reloading delay during the next encounter. This unlimited handgun ammo also makes some of the enemies who were major threats in the main games a little too easy here. The hunters, who could move swiftly, attack for massive damage, and take handgun shots without blinking in the main games, flinch when shot by the handgun here, and can easily be locked into an animation loop where they're taken out with the least powerful weapon in the game. As well, when the hunters and lickers leap at the player to swipe at them, the simplest defense is just running past them as they lunge. Dodging these attacks is far easier than it ever was in the main games, and it kind of drains the fear from the game when enemies are this easy to avoid and overcome. This situation even impacts Mr. X. Yes, he initially appears as the monstrous Kool-Aid Man he was in Resident Evil 2. However, by the game's end, the player has been made to take down hordes of Mr. X's, severely reducing their emotional impact. Sort of. We'll circle around to that in a moment. This is not to say the game is easy overall, though. The lunge dodge only works if there's enough room to run past the monsters, and Survivor bottlenecks the player by using very narrow corridors and catwalks. Yes, narrow hallways are characteristic of the series, but here they constrain movement too much, leading to unnecessary damage. The worst instance of this is the fight with not one but two of the giant alligators from Resident Evil 2. You're stuck on a narrow sewer walkway with an alligator on either end, and no compressed gas canister to help you out with an instant kill. You need to just plug away at one of the gators and hope you're doing your best at avoiding its lunges as well as the gator behind you. Also, because the aiming reticle moves slower than expected, trying to get a bead on one of the Cerberus dogs is far more difficult than it needs to be. The other problem is that there's no way to quickly turn around when you're aiming. Despite being released over a year after Resident Evil 3, the 180-degree turn present in that game is inexplicably absent here. This absence is keenly felt in the final boss battle, where you must keep moving but also quickly turn around to get a few shots in, because the monster is far more agile than you are. Combine all this with far fewer healing items than is found in any other Resident Evil game, as well as the fact that you cannot save your progress, only the guns you've found, which is another throwback from the light gun concept, and suddenly Resident Evil Survivor is a hefty challenge, just not necessarily for the right reasons. Given that Survivor was thrown together as a quick tie-in project, you'd expect that the story would be less than stellar, right? Well, yes and no. The story involving the main protagonist, his amnesia and subsequent mistaken identity, is trite, ham-fisted, and obvious. The plot also pulls the lazy Return of the Jedi / Lost World maneuver with its whole "there was a second research facility but this time it's on an island" premise, along with the most tenuous of tie-ins to Resident Evil 2 at the end.
That's right! At the request of my friend Leon S. Kennedy, I came here to investigate.
It doesn't help that the voice acting is, and I cannot stress this enough, terrible. The protagonist sounds like he's on Valium, and the kids sound like they're in their 20s trying to pass for preteens. I seriously don't know why the original Resident Evil holds the Guinness World Record for worst voice acting in a video game when Survivor exists. I mean, listen to these gems.
Though I can't remember anything, I know that this was no way for anyone to die. Who is this? Vincent? Who's that? Am I Vincent? No, this is me. I am Vincent. It was all my fault.
I was only listening to it because I'm so bored. My brother told me to wait here.
Oh, and while we're at it, for an adult that claims he's trying to help two kids survive and escape an island full of monsters, the protagonist sure seems to be okay with sending them off on their own to venture across the entire island.
Let's go get Lily. Go ahead! Hurry! We'll meet at the station!
The self-destruction system has been activated.
Again, on an island full of monsters. The only reason these kids survived is through the miracle of plot contrivance. Well, okay. Plot contrivance married with the most iconic late 90s fashion ever. There is an interesting branching path structure to the game and therefore the narrative. But, like the translation of traditional Resident Evil controls, it's not entirely successful. At various points in the game, the player is offered a choice between which building, path, or route to take. While the plot overall is not affected, certain characters which help clarify the plot can be missed, making the main story slightly confusing. These branching paths mainly seem to be about choosing difficulty, but that aspect is never explained to the player. In this playthrough, the difficulty spike in branching paths was only revealed when on one path you face a group of Mr. X's, the second path has lickers in close quarters, and the third is open with one-hit enemies. You still wind up at the same endpoint, but how you get there is just a little different. And yet, as with the Resident Evil games that came before it, there are two layers to the plot. There are the main events of the game, taking place as the player experiences them, and then there's the backstory, revealed in the various files and documents found throughout the game. This backstory takes a much different tone and actually recasts some of the triter elements of the main plot in a new light. These files reveal that the administrator for the island facility has been kidnapping children from around the world in order to use them as guinea pigs for Umbrella's biomedical experiments. Seriously, one of the documents discusses how the employees were to think of the kids literally as guinea pigs, so as to not humanize them and get attached. Not only does this smack of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments in the US and the Nazi experiments conducted on Jewish prisoners in World War II, complete with internment facilities that the player sees firsthand, but also of ethnic cleansing. It's not explicitly stated, but heavily implied, that all of the kids used for the experiments are racialized, given their names and countries of origin. On top of that, you also find the diary of Lot, one of the children you're trying to rescue, which discusses how he has been taught that the children brought in for the experiments are inferior to him and the other children of officials on the island. This Hitler Youth approach inured him to their suffering until the administrator slaughtered a group of children trying to escape their fate, gunning them down personally. All of this leads to the reveal that the administrator was harvesting hormones from the kidnapped children without sedation in order to create the collection of Mr. X's the player fights. This recontextualizes the multiple versions of the monster the player encounters in two ways. First, it highlights that Mr. X was always intended to be a mass-produced weapon. Yes, having him as a unique monster in Resident Evil 2 was intimidating, but having him be just another product line on offer from Umbrella is actually far more unnerving. Second, it shifts their presence in the game from just reusing assets over and over again to full-on tragic framing. Each of the Mr. X's the player takes down represents another child who is tortured and killed on the island. Sure, the Resident Evil series has always dealt with issues of corporate greed, body horror, and the impact of a viral outbreak on unprepared communities, but the background in Survivor is something else altogether. That the topics of child exploitation, historical atrocities justified by prejudice and bias, and the ethics of medical testing show up here of all places in the series is surprising and a massive shift from, well, this.
Thank you. You are a good boy, Lot.
This massive shift in tone could potentially be explained by the fact that unlike Resident Evil 2 and 3, writing duties for Survivor were split. Returning from Resident Evil 2 was veteran film and television writer Boru Sugimura, but this time he was joined by Naoki Sakai. Both writers were known at the time for their work on various Sentai series. Sugimura contributed to the Lupin III anime. It's unclear who worked on which aspects, but it may also be telling that Sugimura later wrote the stories for Dino Crisis 2 and 3, as well as Clock Tower 3. You can draw your own conclusions there. Resident Evil Survivor is an awkward game born of an awkward period. It clearly highlights the transition phase the series was going through as it was moving beyond the aging PlayStation 1. It also highlights the tension between pop culture and moral panic in the circumstances around its release. It may not be the best first-person shooter, and it sure isn't the best Resident Evil game, but there are enough interesting aspects here to make for a good weekend rental.
Kept you waiting, huh? Snake's Revenge, the North American exclusive sequel to Metal Gear for the Nintendo Entertainment System, is near universally dismissed and derided because series creator Hideo Kojima was not involved in its development. The question is whether it deserves the hate or is actually a misunderstood gem. I'm Matt from Matt's Retro Room, guest narrating for Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining, and maybe even playing despite themselves. It's almost impossible to discuss Snake's Revenge without going into the history behind it and the Metal Gear series as a whole. So away we go. Metal Gear, developed by Hideo Kojima, was released for the Japanese MSX2 home computer in 1987. In that game, the player takes control of a commando codenamed Solid Snake as he's tasked with infiltrating an installation known as Outer Heaven. Unlike most other military games released by Konami at this time, like, say, Contra, running and gunning is a good way to have your game end quickly. Instead, stealth is the order of the day. The player needs to sneak around, avoiding guards, cameras, and other obstacles and traps. The game was a surprise success in Japan, leading to an English translation for PAL territories later in the year. Snake's Revenge is not a sequel to this game. Instead, it's a sequel to the NES and Famicom port of Metal Gear, released in North America in 1988. The port was not created by Kojima and his team. In fact, it appears that the team tasked with the port was handed the source code for the MSX2 game without the consent of any of the original development team. It's not entirely clear what they did with that source code, though, because the game was kind of a mess. The people behind the ideas in the original weren't there to help translate them to a new platform, so they did not translate well. Areas from the original game were redesigned, generally not for the better. Enemy placement seemed overly chosen to unfairly antagonize the player. New areas were obtuse with no help from the manual, and the poor quality of the English language translation has become legendary. The game was a profitable mess, though, as this would be the only version of Metal Gear that North American audiences would see until 2006, when Metal Gear Solid 3's Subsistence provided players with the proper port of the MSX2 game as a bonus feature. Published under the Ultra Games label, the NES game sold over 1 million units in North America. Seeing these numbers, Konami wanted a sequel as soon as possible. Konami did not, however, call on Kojima to create said sequel, perhaps because he was working on various iterations of Snatcher at the time. And yes, you're seeing that right, there's a chibi version of Snatcher, because why not? Also, because this was a response to the North American success of the game, Snake's Revenge would not actually receive a Japanese release, despite being developed at Konami's Japanese offices. All of this led to the well-known story where Kojima learned about the development of Snake's Revenge while riding the train home from the office with a member of the team working on it, and said member pleaded with him to make the true sequel to Metal Gear. Okay, so Snake's Revenge is a sequel to Metal Gear, but not the canon sequel. It's not even the sequel to the proper Metal Gear. Hideo Kojima did not work on it or even have any input into its creation. Fine. How is it on its own merits, though? Well, to be honest, it's kind of a mess. To be fair, considering the fact that it's a follow-up to the NES port of Metal Gear, which was also kind of a mess, it's not entirely Snake's Revenge's fault. Based on the end credits for both games, it appears that none of the team behind the NES port of Metal Gear worked on Snake's Revenge, which means that Snake's Revenge was likely developed by a third, all-new team. Considering the use of pseudonyms and the poor translations for the game credits from the NES era, though, that's not definitive proof one way or the other. Either way, the game has problems. For one thing, just like the first NES game, Snake's Revenge doesn't care where you're entering the screen from. If you're in the guard's sightline, you're getting spotted. The MSX game actually did move guards, so this wouldn't happen, and the player would have a fair chance to remain hidden. The NES game offered a sort of fix by having it so that alarms ended once the player transitioned to the next screen. Not here, though. Here the alarm continues until you kill all of the alerted guards rushing at you, no matter how many screens you run through. For a game that constantly repopulates enemies, having this sort of persistence just seems mean-spirited. On top of that, the stealth is, let's call it inconsistent. Sight lanes and detection boxes for guards and security cameras are temperamental. For example, here's a point in the playthrough where Snake is literally standing on a guard's head and yet has not been detected. On the opposite side, here are some security cameras which should not be able to see Snake but keep detecting him. Again, and again, and again, and again. Oh, and a quick note about those security cameras. They don't have a blind spot directly underneath them. As soon as sprites overlap, the player is spotted just as surely as if they had run face first into a guard. In fairness, MSX Metal Gear was the same way. It was the NES Metal Gear that actually introduced the idea of blind spots. The pit death traps from Metal Gear are back, and in much greater number. In the NES Metal Gear, they opened slowly enough so you could conceivably dodge them, and were actually expected to do so in one notoriously difficult area of the game. In Snake's Revenge, they're instant death. It would be fine if any of your equipment were capable of detecting traps like, say, the X-ray lens, but nope, instant death. With no way to know they're there ahead of time, it gets really tiresome in the late game areas. Oh, speaking of not being able to detect stuff, there are so many points where the path forward is cryptic and obtuse, much like another Konami game from the same time period, Castlevania II Simon's Quest. Take this instance, where Snake gets a radio message that the entrance to the compound is somewhere on the grounds. What does that mean? Where are the grounds? Is there some other way to detect this entrance? Nope. Instead, there's a building with regenerating plastic explosives, which somehow means that the player is supposed to bomb everything in order to discover the hidden passage under a sandbag. Does the sandbag make a distinct sound when punching it, like false walls? Nope. Why is it under a sandbag instead of part of the wall? Don't worry about it. Even here, though, that's not enough, because the passage is guarded by a dude who fires homing missiles at Snake, only after the entrance has been discovered. In other words, once the player decrypts the obtuse clues, finds the right spot, and figures out the right equipment to access it, they're still likely going to take some unavoidable damage in order to move forward. Unavoidable damage seems to be the running theme in this discussion, and it extends to the bosses as well. Most of the boss encounters seem designed so that the player is forced to take at least some damage during the fight. You can see it in the fight against the attack unit that makes up the first boss, where dodging the attacks is near impossible at first. The fight against John Turner, where the combination of the mines he uses with another pit trap make it hard to avoid the shrapnel thrown from the mines. And then there's the cyborg version of the final boss, whose identity we won't reveal here, but we'll discuss a little bit. So spoiler warning for a 30-year-old game, I guess. The unavoidable damage from the bosses, the ridiculous amount of instant death pit traps, and the issues with stealth detection all feel deliberate, and it's entirely possible that they were. Remember that this game was being developed with a North American audience in mind in 1990. Well, why is that important? Because this is the area of video rental stores. In Japan, the rental of video games was made illegal as of 1984, meaning that, in order to experience a game, you or someone you knew had to buy it outright. In North America, someone could walk into a rental store, rent a game, and beat it in a weekend, and then return it. The publishers would lose that game's sale. As a result, games were intentionally made more difficult for North American audiences. That's why saves were removed from the original Castlevania, well, that and the lack of a Famicom disk system, and that's why the Savannah level of The Lion King is so finicky. That's why auto-aim was removed from the initial release of Resident Evil, And yeah, it's a strong possibility that's why Snake's Revenge is the way it is. Then there are the side-scrolling levels. They're a neat idea in theory. Take the mechanics of Metal Gear and apply them to a more familiar side-scrolling perspective of games like Simon's Quest or Contra. In fact, the side-scrolling sections look uncannily like the NES adaptation of Konami's Russian Attack, one of the unambiguous run-and-gun military games which Kojima himself made Metal Gear to act as an antithesis to. Therein lies the problem. These side-scrolling stages want to keep the stealth gameplay of Metal Gear, but they're designed as though for Russian Attack, which means that there are multiple points where stealth is near impossible. Also, can we talk about the oxygen tanks used in these stages for a minute? Look at how quickly Snake goes through 5 oxygen tanks. How much is he hyperventilating that he can blow through 5 tanks in under 2 minutes? Seriously, let's watch this in real time.
I can't breathe. What the heck? Need more oxygen. I need more oxygen. 5 tanks is not enough oxygen. I breathe 5 tanks every night. 5 oxygen tanks. I need at least 20.
Even NES Metal Gear recognized that 1 oxygen tank would take care of a human adult, Snake in this example, for the entirety of his mission. In Snake's Revenge, you need to make sure you are fully stocked up on oxygen tanks wherever you go into a side-scrolling section, because this mechanic is merciless. When you run out of oxygen tanks, the game starts running through the health bar at the same speed. Oh, we also need to talk about some of the problems with representation in this game. First off, hey Konami America, Ultra. Hey Ultra, just because you have a woman on your team and she's a spy doesn't mean you need to refer to her as Foxy anytime you so much as mention her. They do it on the back of the box. In the heading for the second descriptions in the manual, also, can we take a second to appreciate those amazing drawings, and the fact that they seem to have basically swapped the pictures for Snake and JT. Ugh. Basically anywhere where she's mentioned as a character instead of a game mechanic. Oh, sidebar. If overly muscled Snake looks oddly familiar, that's because he is. He is clearly inspired by the poster for the Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle Commando. What about this mournful close-up at the end of the game? Yep, that's Martin Sheen in Apocalypse Now. There's another equally blatant problem to look at regarding representation, though. Considering Snake's Revenge is a Konami game from the 80s without the involvement of the clearly and vocally anti-war stance Kojima, the unquestioned pro-militarism is kinda to be expected. Okay, fair enough. What's kind of unexpected is the straight-up racism displayed in the enemy design. Let's take a closer look at the standard enemy sprite for the first half of the game. That is clearly a shirtless brown dude wearing a turban with a bandolier strapped across his chest. Wow, that's not even subtle racism there, is it? That design looks like it came right out of Jack Shahian's Real Bad Arabs. That dives into realms of wampum levels of cultural insensitivity. It also gets worse when you take into the account that since this is the stock sprite for enemy soldiers for the first half of the game, that means that Snake, and therefore the player, is going to be killing so many of these racist Hollywood terrorist stereotypes. And we know they're terrorists too, because all of the marketing material for the game goes out of its way to make sure people know that Snake is fighting terrorists. Copyrighted. The print ad for the game shows it in block letter headlines. The manual mentions that they're terrorists so many times. Honestly, I don't know why I was expecting anything different from a game whose marketing decided to name the main villain, who I'm going to get to, I promise, Hayrola Khamenei. Clear parody of a real-world Iranian leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And is right up there with Russian Attack in terms of wordplay. Stay classy, 80s Konami. Phew, that's a lot of complaints about Snake's Revenge. So does it do anything right? Yeah, but it takes a bit of work to get at it. First, it's interesting to see how many ideas that show up in later Kojima-helmed Metal Gear games make their first appearances here. This is the first time that Snake is sent on a mission with actual equipment, including a knife and a gun. Kojima wouldn't get around doing that until Metal Gear Solid 2, a full 11 years and 3 games later. There's also an interesting risk-reward mechanic at play with the use of the knife. By default, Snake does not have a knife equipped, meaning that he will punch enemies to attack them. This will take multiple hits to dispatch his standard soldier. The knife, on the other hand, can take out an enemy with a single hit. It would seem like common sense that you would just want to stick with the knife throughout the game, right? Not so fast. Yes, the knife takes out enemies with one hit, but there's a drawback to using it exclusively, which you won't even notice if you do so. Enemies will drop items, like rations and ammo, when dispatched, but only if you use your bare hands. Going the apparently easy route using the knife means that items will be in far shorter supply. Then there's the part of the game where Snake needs to infiltrate a freighter ship carrying mass-produced versions of the original Metal Gear design. Not only is this a much more interesting way to get a point in the game to the other, I'm looking at you when I say this, NES Metal Gear trucks, but it also highlights how Metal Gear was always intended to be mass-produced artillery, like tanks or planes. On top of that, it's also an idea that's echoed once again in Metal Gear Solid 2, the entire first portion of the game. Not to mention the infamous demo that came with the Zone of the Enders, as Snake doing almost the exact same thing here in Snake's Revenge. Then there's the plot points, which make appearances in Kojima Metal games much sooner. Oh, that's right, spoilers ahead for 30-year-old games. First, there's the traitor on the team working for the leader of the villainous group, John Turner in Snake's Revenge, and Grey Fox in Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Both involve landmines during their boss encounters. Then there's the main villain. Yes, Big Boss makes his return in Metal Gear 2, trying to re-establish Outer Heaven, but guess who did it first? That's right, Snake's Revenge. The whole Hyrola Kakamimi thing was just a smokescreen, and Big Boss is the final enemy of the game. Not only that, but in a twist that hints at both Metal Gear Solid 4 and Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, which will never not be fun to say, it's revealed that Big Boss survived the first game by being turned into a decidedly Robocop-esque cyborg, but is definitely not Robocop. Nope, not Robocop whatsoever. Don't ask me why the cyborg version of Big Boss is bigger than when he was wearing his skin suit though, because for that, I got nothing. Oh, and it needs to be pointed out that Snake's Revenge is also the first time North American players actually face a Metal Gear. The only thing players dealt with at the end of the NES Metal Gear was a supercomputer, with a specific sequence of plastic explosives that needed to be followed in order to defeat it. Not exactly high-tension climax there. Here, though, the player has to destroy an actual Metal Gear before it launches its nuclear payload. You know, the threat that was behind the plots of all the games in the series. Snake's Revenge is a mishmash of interesting ideas, inconsistent mechanics, and problematic representation, and its attempts of humor are pathetic. Its gameplay wildly facilitates between inspired, insipid, unfair, and unintelligible, which makes it hard to recommend in the modern era. Between the dated and sometimes broken mechanics, the unquestioning pro-military stance, and the representation issues in the marketing materials and the game itself, it is fully understandable if you cannot bring yourself to play it nowadays. There might be enough interesting ideas here though to make it a good weekend rental, but at least it's not Metal Gear Survive.
God of War is a 2005 PlayStation 2 game produced by Sony Santa Monica Studio, in which the player takes on the role of Kratos, a warrior with a mysterious past, tasked by the Greek gods to fight a myriad of monsters from Greek mythology using blades chained to his wrists in flashy, combo-focused combat. Wait, hold on a minute. There's something wrong here. Oh, okay, I know what the problem is. Rygar, The Legendary Adventure, is a 2002 Sony PlayStation 2 game by Tecmo, in which the player takes on the role of Rygar, a warrior with a mysterious past, tasked by divine influence to fight a myriad of monsters from Greek and Roman mythology using a blade chained to his wrist in flashy, combo-focused combat. The question is the comparison to God of War warranted, and if so, why isn't Rygar more widely and fondly remembered? This is Sarah. I'm a PhD candidate and feminist media scholar from Toronto, and today I'll be guest narrating for Makopowered. And welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not classics or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing, despite themselves. For Snake's Revenge and Resident Evil Survivor, we've had to dive into the respective histories of those franchises, because those games needed that context to be discussed properly. While the Rygar franchise has been around for almost 35 years, it's kind of hard to do that here. Sure, there have been ports. There have been a lot of ports. Those have mostly been adaptations of the original arcade game, though. In actuality, there have really only been 3 distinct games in the series. The original 1986 arcade game, which was quite literally a straightforward action game. The 1987 Nintendo Entertainment System game, which, developed in the shadow of Dragon Quest, became a proto-Metroidvania, and then there's Rygar, The Legendary Adventure, which lands somewhere in the middle. It's not entirely linear, but it doesn't encourage widespread exploration either. At the same time, there isn't really a need to talk about the history of the franchise when talking about Rygar, The Legendary Adventure. There are little nods to the games that came before it, sure, but it's almost entirely unrelated to the other games in the franchise. The opening of the game features the sunset background emblematic of all the Rygar games, for example, and Rygar opens new areas by turning giant urns, as in the original arcade game. Oh, and the disc armor is still called the disc armor. That's about it, though. The protagonist here is no longer the warrior of Argul from the arcade and NES games, who, as indicated on Wikipedia and by games journalist and historian Jeremy Parrish, may or may not actually be named Rygar. In this case, the protagonist is most definitely named Rygar. Characters, including himself, say and or yell his name multiple times. And he's a warrior of Argus, which appears to be part of the Roman Empire, an aspect which we'll discuss in a moment. There are no three-eyed wise men from Endora who provide the player with clues and equipment during the quest. Instead, new items are found in the environments, and new clues and combat moves are found in scrolls provided by only one wise man, who hails from Greece, not Endora, and is definitely something else we'll need to discuss in a moment. It also does not appear that any of the development team for the prior games in the series worked on The Legendary Adventure, although, as discussed in previous videos, the inconsistency of information about Japanese game developers from the NES era makes that hard to verify one way or the other. As it stands, there doesn't appear to be any information on Rygar, or even Tecmo itself on the Game Developer Research Institute website. So Rygar has very little in common with the previous games in the series. That's fine, it can be considered a reboot. Instead, it uses an amalgamation of monsters, myths, real people, and historical events from classical Greek and Roman history. It's kind of like Kingdom Hearts, just combining Greek and Roman myth and history instead of Disney and Square Enix properties. It's this mashup, combined with the stylish combo-heavy gameplay, which makes the game so interesting. Oh, and of course, spoilers ahead. Also, a Greco-Roman mythology and history lesson. The first example of this Greco-Roman influence is relatively minor, but the first boss the player encounters is the Hecaton Kyries, a monster from Greek mythology who fought alongside the Olympian gods against the Titans in the Titanomachy. In the original myth, the 3 monsters were giants with at least 50 heads and 100 hands. The name, Hecaton Kyries, literally translates to 100-handed ones. Hold on, there seem to be a few discrepancies here though, don't there? First, in Rygar, the Hecaton Kyries, spelt with a C in the Roman style instead of the Greek style with a K, are fighting on the side of the Titans instead of the Olympian gods. That's not as contradictory as it would appear, though. Before aiding the gods, the Hecaton Kyries helped the Titans in their ascendancy. More specifically, they helped Kronos defeat Uranus. Considering Kronos is the main villain of the game, their help here isn't that much of a deviation from classical myth. Okay, fine. Except, where are the 100 hands and whatnot? They just appear to be statues of 2 dudes and a horse. Yeah, they do, until the player damages the boss enough to shatter some of the stone, at which point a bunch of undulating tentacles appear in the cracks of the statues. In that case, the difference between tentacles and hands is a matter of nitpicking over appendages. More interesting is the way the game incorporates actual historical figures into its narrative. The game says that Alexander the Great, his teacher Aristotle, and his lover, the warrior Argo, sealed the Titans in Tartaros, spelled in the Greek style here. Then, Aristotle, corrupted by the Titans, joins forces with Cleopatra, who is seeking revenge over the death of her son Caesarion to release Kronos, king of the Titans, for reasons. Oh boy, there is a lot to unpack there. First, Alexander the Great, as far as we know, didn't fight any gods or monsters. He did, however, take on Aristotle as his teacher. Yes, that Aristotle, student of Plato, author of the Poetics. In that regard, the game 100% gets it right. On the other hand, Aristotle was never a warrior as such, nor did he wind up becoming a Raziel knockoff who fought against, well, anyone. He also didn't leave scrolls littered around the Roman Empire. Again, that's as far as we know, though. Argo, on the other hand, was never the name of a person. Instead, it was the name of the ship that Jason and the Argonauts sailed on. It's possible the developers were confusing the ship with just the masthead, which in the 1963 film, titled, appropriately enough, Jason and the Argonauts, was in the shape of Hera, and through which she would communicate with Jason during his quest. There's no concrete evidence one way or the other for that, though. In classical myth, Kronos did get sealed in Tartaros by the Olympian gods, so point to the game there. The most interesting part is the Cleopatra-Caesarion relationship, though, both in the game and in real life. In the game, Cleopatra lost Caesarion and, believing him to be murdered, sided with the Titans. By the game's end, everyone learns that Rygar is Caesarion, who's been robbed of his memories and is residing in the Roman Empire as a, gladiator, generic warrior? It's not entirely clear, but he's willing to fight for the Roman princess? Okay, so the game plays fast and loose with Roman history. Just a little. Roman princesses, unclear societal roles, monsters, and magic aside, the Caesarion thing is interesting because that notion is entirely plausible in real life. The reason for this is because Cleopatra, the famous one, actually had a son named Caesarion, who was named that because he was also rumored to be the sole child and biological heir of Julius Caesar. Caesarion was forced to flee Egypt at the age of 17 during the conflict between Cleopatra and Augustus Caesar, Julius Caesar's chosen heir. During his flight, Caesarion was allegedly killed, but his death was never confirmed, so it is entirely possible that Caesarion did live out the rest of his life in the Roman Empire in hiding, just like Rygar here. Whew, okay. So Rygar the Legendary Adventure does some interesting things with myth and history. What about the actual gameplay, though? Well, the comparison to God of War at the beginning of the video wasn't just for laughs. To say that God of War borrowed liberally from Rygar would be a bit of an understatement. Both protagonists use bladed weapons chained to their wrists, given to them by the gods. Both protagonists are also based on kind of real people. Well, real might be a stretch with Kratos, as he's based on a minor and obscure Greek god, but still. Both games rely heavily on classical themes and settings. Both games use a combo-based combat system, which rewards players for stringing together moves and kills using said chained blade, although to be fair, both games can thank Devil May Cry for that particular gameplay system. Both have magic bestowed on them by the gods, which takes the form of temporary, potentially screen-clearing attacks. Both have the hero smashing parts of the environment to gain power-ups, although Rygar actually provides an in-story explanation for why that is. Apparently, the Titans can possess any stonework for some reason, so smashing it all prevents them from doing so. On that note, remember the Hecaton Kyries mentioned earlier? God of War 2's first boss, the Colossus of Rhodes, is, well, let's just call it remarkably similar. Even the structure of the respective games' plots mirror each other, with each hero fighting through a variety of locales, both real and mythological, before being cast down into Tartaros prior to the final battle against a classical deity. Although Dave Jaffe, creator of God of War, along with Twisted Metal, has never mentioned Rygar in conjunction with his game, there are way too many similarities to just be coincidence. That is not to say that God of War plays exactly the same as Rygar. God of War makes numerous improvements on Rygar's gameplay. For one thing, trying to build combos in the early game is, well, let's be generous and call it difficult. Using the default disc armor, Rygar will get locked into his attack animation, including the direction of the attack, meaning that if the player defeats an enemy halfway through, the rest of the attack cannot be turned towards a different enemy. This issue is made better once the player gets the C disc armor, but that's not perfect either, as Reach gets sacrificed for combo ability. Also, 2 of the 3 disc armors are slow. All of the weapons in God of War have a decent sense of immediacy to them, but both the Hades and Heavenly disc armor feel like they're floaty, cutting through molasses filled with helium. It's hard to describe, but they don't feel like actually throwing a blade around on a chain. Then there's the dodge mechanic, which God of War definitely improves on because, to put it bluntly, Rygar doesn't have one. The closest it comes to is the slide move, but that requires 3 different button presses, holding down a shoulder button while pressing both the jump button and the direction the player wants to slide. It's cumbersome and makes some of the bosses more difficult than they should be. I'm looking at you, Typhon. The platforming also leaves something to be desired, especially in the, what do we want to call it, floating sky platform section? I mean, the platforming is frustrating enough as is because it's hard to tell where Rygar is going to land. Using his shadow as an indicator is not as precise as it could be. Combine that with the section where the developers were more concerned with cool camera angles and sweeping visuals than making sure the player knows where they're jumping, or the fact that certain floating platforms move, and it's a sure recipe for irritation. At least in this section, the developers made sure the player wasn't really penalized for falling. It's almost as though they knew it would be a ridiculous difficulty spike, and that players would fall over and over and over again. Those camera angles and sweeping visuals are pretty cool, though. Oh, one other thing. While Rygar doesn't have the deeply ingrained, creepy, violent misogyny that God of War has, seriously, even the threesome minigame feels uncomfortably violent, the game does have its own issues surrounding its female characters. First, there's the surprisingly stodgy dynamic of the blonde-haired woman, Princess Harmonia, being the virtuous one, and the darker-haired woman, Cleopatra, being the femme fatale. This dynamic dates back at least a century. As Jim Harmon and Donald Glut detail in their book, The Great Movie Serials, this sort of hair color stereotyping is definitely a thing, and is the reason why Dale Arden, who's a brunette in the comics, was turned into a blonde in the first Flash Gordon movie serial in 1936. Speaking of views that seem to come from the 1930s, there's another issue with the way Cleopatra is depicted. She's a little too, well, white. I mean, sure, Cleopatra, the real Cleopatra that is, was a descendant of Alexander the Great, so there would be Greek heritage there, but she probably would not have been as light-skinned as she's depicted here. In other words, she likely looked more like this than like this. This is an issue perhaps explainable, if not justifiable. After all, the popular modern conception of Cleopatra is largely based on Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal of her. Yes, that's from the 1950s, but people still dress up as Cleopatra based on Taylor's look for the role to this day. So, yeah. Oh, one more way in which Rygar distinguishes itself from God of War is with its, let's call it anime influences. This can show up in things like the summons tied to each disc armor, which resemble the summons in Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy, or the special moves in Shoujo Senshi anime, like this clip from Sailor Moon, for example. It can show up in the out-of-nowhere non-sequitur music video that kicks in mid-dialogue towards the end of the game. I mean, Harmonia literally goes from unconscious to karaoke-quality music video. Let's just stop to appreciate how this unfolds for a second.
You have already lost the pride of a warrior of Hades. What do you know about me?
Please don't. The sun smiles down on us, this whole new world, blessed with sanity, following the wind to an oasis called eternity.
I know that voice. Is that you, Argo?
Then there are solid gold lines that, like the music video, come out of nowhere, like these.
Was that the guard dog of Hades? No, it was not. It was the Fang that rages against injustice. If that is so, please, please lead me to the princess. I wish to reward her hopes. I am only a mere warrior, but wish to give her peace of mind. I swear my victory to this feather!
Rygar the Legendary Adventure is definitely a hidden gem in the PS2 library, as long as you can look past the silly dialogue and delivery, and the dated game mechanics which would be improved upon by its successors. It is, at the very least, a game whose importance is overlooked in favor of higher profile releases that followed in its footsteps, which is a shame. It's also a shame that the Wii port of the game, titled Rygar the Battle of Argus, was criticized for not improving on the original in any way, despite being released 6 years later. And no, giving Rygar a bro-tastic makeover, including tribal tats, a soul patch, and spiky hair, is not considered an improvement. Much like Rygar for the NES, however, Rygar the Legendary Adventure offers an intriguing look forward at what was to come for the gaming landscape on their respective consoles, which makes it a good weekend rental.
The name is Bond. James Bond.
James Bond 007 for the Game Boy is an anomaly for both the Game Boy and the James Bond franchise, combining disparate influences into a game that, while not even close to a unique experience, still offers some interesting and possibly subversive takes on the character and the movie franchise. This is Chris from Makopowered, and hey look, I'm actually narrating a video again! I mean, welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. Before we dive in, a quick note. The timing for the Resident Evil Survivor video was a little off. That should have been saved for October to coincide with Halloween. So, why is the December video about James Bond? Because in the 90s, back before they endlessly repeated A Christmas Story, TBS would have annual holiday James Bond marathons. Dubbed 13 Days of 007, there was something of a holiday tradition for me, and so, James Bond on the Game Boy for the holidays. Okay, now that that's out of the way, if you were a gamer in the 90s, when you think of James Bond, you probably think of this. Or, more likely, this. Or, if you were a PlayStation gamer, you might have been stuck with this. Chances are you would not think of a cartoonish, black and white Game Boy game which bears more than a passing resemblance to Link's Awakening. And yet, that is exactly what 1998's James Bond for the Game Boy offered players. The game's pedigree may have something to do with this resemblance. The game was developed by Sapphire, a Utah-based developer who seems to be largely responsible for middling to low-quality licensed fare, like Xena Talisman of Fate for the Nintendo 64, Van Helsing for the PlayStation 2, and, Peter Pan for the Game Boy Advance. Sorry, Peter Pan the Motion Picture Event for the Game Boy Advance. Oh, they also happen to have made StarCraft Brood War. That's right, they're responsible for one of the most successful video game expansions of all time. That expertise, with overhead gameplay mechanics, combined with the fact that James Bond was published by Nintendo themselves, makes the Link's Awakening similarities make much more sense. These similarities aren't even subtle either. Early in the game, Bond gets a machete that is pretty much a direct analog to Link's sword. The rank-and-file enemies largely act like the moblins found throughout Koholint Island. The inventory system is almost identical. There's a section of the game dedicated to trading items with various characters. There are labyrinthine mazes to navigate, some with large doors to unlock. With so many similarities, it's surprising that there aren't any Mario cameos. And no, there aren't actually any Mario cameos. Okay, so given that this is a James Bond game from the late 90s, published by Nintendo in the wake of the unprecedented success of GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64 the previous year, you'd figure that the game would try to hew as close to GoldenEye, or at least then current James Bond, Pierce Brosnan, as possible, right? Yeah, you'd think that. You'd be wrong, though. For some inexplicable reason, the majority of the game is modeled after the Roger Moore version of Bond and the 007 movies that he starred in. Keep in mind that the last Moore-starring Bond film was released 13 years prior to the game's release. 1997's Tomorrow Never Dies had just come out the year prior, so it's not like Brosnan was just a one-and-done deal. George Lazenby. The choice to go with Moore's more cartoonish style over Brosnan's more grounded version of the character, remember, Die Another Day hadn't come out yet, is puzzling. Nintendo Power even warned readers that they would be disappointed if they went in looking for a similar experience to GoldenEye on the N64, as though that were even possible on the original Game Boy. Despite this, James Bond for the Game Boy may just be more faithful to the franchise overall than GoldenEye on the N64. The developers clearly went all in on the Roger Moore era. First, the image of Bond on the title screen bears more of a resemblance to publicity photos of Moore's Bond than to Brosnan's. Then there's the overall plot, which mirrors that of 1983's Octopussy in broad strokes. A rogue Russian general, Gogol here, possibly a confused reference to Gogol in the films, who is a much different character, is preparing to launch a stockpile of nuclear weapons in order to assert his position of dominance on the world stage. He is funding his ambitions using a smuggling operation run by a strong, willful female character, Zhong Mei in the game, the eponymous character in Octopussy, who sees the error of her ways and aids Bond in his fight against the general's mad ambitions. You could also argue that the plot also resembles both 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me and 1979's Moonraker, which, let's be real, was just a rehash of The Spy Who Loved Me, right down to Jaws, who we'll come back to soon. In both of those movies, the villain wanted to cause nuclear war in order to establish their own order as the dominant one. And if there's still any doubt about the game being inspired by the Roger Moore movies specifically, the developers wiped that doubt away by using an 8-bit chiptune version of Duran Duran's A View to a Kill during the game's ending. This structure is bolstered by nods to other Roger Moore Bond movies, most notably 1974's The Man with the Golden Gun. For example, Zhong Mei's martial arts school in the China section at the beginning of the game references a similar scene in The Man with the Golden Gun. The Man with the Golden Gun is also referenced in the Marrakesh section of the game, where Bond navigates the city's black market, which the game hilariously depicts as an actual market that people go to. In the catacombs just past the black market, the Man with the Golden Gun comes up again in the way Bond obtains the diamond used to buy the tranquilizer dart used to obtain the key to Oddjob's hotel room. See? Link's Awakening style trading quest. Wait, Oddjob? As in 1964 Goldfinger Oddjob? As in the GoldenEye multiplayer character that even the Rare devs admit is cheating Oddjob? Yeah. I mean, they do get aspects of him right. Better than GoldenEye at any rate. For one thing, the game makes him much more imposing than GoldenEye. The reason Oddjob was considered cheating in GoldenEye is that he was short. Short enough that it was difficult to aim at him using the single analog stick N64 controller. This hints at an uncomfortable bias on the part of the developers. See, Toru Tanaka, the man who played Oddjob in Goldfinger, was 5'11". The only reason Tanaka seemed short in Goldfinger was because Sean Connery was 6'2". In other words, it wasn't that Tanaka was short, it was that Connery was tall, and even then, only by a couple of inches. The fact that Rare made Oddjob so short in GoldenEye plays into the obviously incorrect racial stereotype about Asians being short, which makes playing as him in multiplayer even worse now, doesn't it? Okay, so the Game Boy game gets Oddjob's physical stature correct. That's cool. There are other aspects of his depiction here which are, let's be generous and call them questionable. For one thing, Oddjob is, astoundingly chatty at various points in the game, isn't he? Why is his chattiness astounding? Because Oddjob is supposed to be mute. In Goldfinger, both the book and the movie, it's established that Oddjob has a disability which precludes him from being able to speak. It's okay to have a villainous character act as an exposition dump for the plot, but the developers could have used anyone for that role. It feels like they chose Oddjob for that odd job solely because he is one of the most recognizable James Bond villains in the entire franchise, erasing his disability in the process. And no, I am not apologizing for that terrible wordplay. Also, I'm not sure what's going on when the player actually fights Oddjob. He's throwing at hatted Bond, but it's multiple hats? While his sprite still clearly has the hat on his head? How? You know what? It's fine. It's fine. At least it's better than whatever's going on here with the James Bond Jr. incarnation of the character. Here's the thing with all of these nods to the Bond movie franchise, though. They don't take place in cutscenes. This video game version of Bond, unlike almost every other Bond game before or after, tasks the player with more than just shooting enemies. Sure, the player shoots enemies. A lot of enemies. Or punches them, or machetes them, or you get the idea. But the player also fulfills the staples of the more Bond formula, specifically through gameplay. For example, the player must be successful enough at the regular casino tables to earn access to the High Rollers room and attract the attention of the henchman who frequents it, the walking stereotype that is Mr. Fez, so that Bond can use the tranquilizer dart mentioned to knock Fez out for the key to Oddjob's room. Plot points and story beats, which are just covered in cutscenes in other Bond games, even recent ones like 2010's 007 Bloodstone, are actual playable portions of the game here. On that note, going back to the Roger Moore Bond movies, more specifically The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, which again, one's just a remake of the other, Jaws also makes an appearance here as well. Unlike with Oddjob, here the game mostly gets it right. Jaws is large and imposing, he doesn't speak, and the player can defeat him in almost the exact same way Bond did in The Spy Who Loved Me. The only thing the developers changed is that Jaws' bites cause considerably less damage than they did in the movies. Which is not a bad thing because one-hit kills against a video game boss are generally not okay. And hey, again, at least making him weaker still doesn't make him as goofy as he is in James Bond Jr. We're not even going to touch the weird monstrous Orientalism going on with the James Bond Jr. version of Dr. No. Actually, you know what? No. Let's talk about that Orientalism for a moment, because it's a problem in the game as well. Let's go back to the Marrakesh portion of the game. Why is the entire city swarming with flies? Why is the black market infested with rats? Did the developers think that the city was just that dirty? What is going on here? Just as this section of the game evokes the man with the golden gun, as mentioned earlier, it also references the racism in the man with the golden gun. It's kind of surprising that racist redneck caricature, comic relief character, J.W. Pepper doesn't make an appearance in the game, since he would definitely fit right in. By that token, why does the China level have to be the martial arts level? I mean, sure, the way the game structures the combat here is kinda cool, forcing the player to be patient, blocking attacks, and waiting for an opening before striking. It's more nuanced than the typical combat in games of this type. Why then is it never used in the same way again in the game? Wait, sorry, I take that back. The same combat mechanics appear in Tibet, where the player fights room after room of sumo wrestlers? Why? Tibet isn't exactly known for its vibrant sumo scene, considering sumo is a Japanese sport. So why are there sumo wrestlers here? Yeah, I know why. racial stereotyping and generalizations. Still. Also, the game's version of Russia is, awkward. When Bond goes to Russia at the end of the game, it's just a labyrinth of corroded nuclear waste vats. Sure, Bond is there to stop the launch of nuclear missiles, but that's not why Russia is being shown like this. It's kind of clear that this is cartoon shorthand for the whole Chernobyl thing, and there are a few issues with that. First, Chernobyl isn't Russian, it's Ukrainian. It's part of Ukraine. Second, the Chernobyl disaster happened in 1986. By 1998, the radiation levels at Chernobyl were down to safely habitable levels. Using the Chernobyl disaster as shorthand for Russia doesn't make sense if you know anything about it, and just seems uncomfortably crass and disrespectful to an actual disaster that happened in real life. This is video games though, and why would I expect differently? And yet, despite these problems, the game also makes some interesting critiques of the colonialist nature of James Bond as a character. Remember, Bond is a nationalist agent. Sure, saving the world is great, but Bond's driving motivation is usually to protect British interests around the globe. Sometimes that means he makes things worse rather than better. Such is the case with the Kurdistan sections in the game. When Bond first goes there after the China mission, he kills Iqbal, the dictator controlling the region. Okay, great. No more dictator is a good thing, right? Not exactly. The player returns to Kurdistan after defeating Oddjob to discover that all of the characters they interacted with the first time around have been slaughtered wholesale. How did this happen? It turns out that Iqbal, in addition to being a dictator, kept the region from descending into chaos. Without him to hold everything together, Golgov's associates, Saddam and Qatar, really with those names, started causing untold death and destruction with widespread bombings. All of which was Bond's fault, and therefore, the players. Talking to the few survivors during the return trip, they all curse him for the misery he caused without a second thought for the consequences. It's surprisingly heavy stuff for a lightweight Game Boy game where the main villain hops into a mech suit to fight Bond. An easily destroyed mech suit. Oh, speaking of the end of the game, a quick sidebar. So, aside from the title screen, all of the graphics in the game are cartoonish, almost crudely so. Bond just looks like guy in a suit. All of the other figures are drawn in the broadest strokes possible, and the environments pretty much follow suit. Which is why it's so jarring that, if you get the good ending for the game, part of that ending is a highly detailed image of Zhong Mei, which just happens to look uncannily like Jennifer Garner from Significant Others. I really don't know what to do with this. It is really disconcerting in context. James Bond 007 for the Game Boy is a mishmash of the Roger Moore James Bond movies in an era where those movies are outdated, with an, at that point, 5-year-old Nintendo game. It does a good job of actually having the player participate in more aspects of Bond's lifestyle than arguably any other James Bond game to date, complete with the problems inherent in that lifestyle. The cartoonish shorthand used throughout the game can make it awkward, but it's not a long game, and if you're a fan of James Bond, it does enough right to make for a good weekend rental.
Commando Elite!